Simple Insights, your best YouTube channel.
The dollar is the most common global currency in the world. How much the dollar is spread out is just as contradictory. Let's do the same thing. Will our savings turn into candy wrappers tomorrow? Columbus finds America and sets the dollar in motion. At the end of the 15th century, Spanish navigator Christopher Columbus set out for India by a route unknown to Europeans, heading west. As you know, Columbus never reached India, but he did stumble upon the Caribbean islands, which he named the West Indies. He believed he discovered the eastern coast of India, or at worst, China or Japan. Little did Columbus know he was looking for copper, but found gold. A year later, soldiers and laborers arrived in the West Indies bringing weapons, livestock, and seeds. Europeans began colonizing America. Over the next 250 years, indigenous populations were driven from their ancestral lands, and many tribes were enslaved. The discovery of the New World attracted people from all across Eurasia, fleeing poverty, hunger, and persecution. Leading European powers, France, Spain, and Great Britain, established colonies in America and began extracting gold, tobacco, cotton, and other resources. Money flowed into Europe like a river. Birth of the United States and the road to independence. By the mid-18th century, 13 British colonies on the eastern seaboard of North America united to resist the metropolis. In 1776, they declared independence from Great Britain. Thus, the United States of America was founded, and the nation began its expansion westward across the continent. Forced labor of enslaved Africans remained the main engine of the U.S. economy for decades, especially in the South. The struggle between Southern planters and the industrial Northern states for power led to civil war. In 1865, the North won, and slavery was abolished de jure in all states. Now the fuel for the country's industrialization was rapidly replenished by cheap labor. Former slaves, debtors, and tens of millions of immigrants who continued arriving on the continent chasing the American dream. Indigenous peoples and the Wild West question. One last major internal issue remained on the path to economic supremacy. What to do with the indigenous population, the Native Americans? They were still fighting for their lands in the Wild West, hindering gold mining and the expansion of railroads. The issue was resolved indirectly. By the end of the 19th century, due to mass hunting of the American bison, Native Americans lost the object of their main livelihood. Bison were shot from trains and carcasses were left lying in the prairies. Exhausted by hunger, Native Americans were forced to relocate to reservations. Now, having dealt with internal problems, the U.S. began its path to global hegemony, and the two largest wars in human history would provide the biggest opportunities. From Spanish pesos to the American dollar. The first colonists, as you remember, were Spanish. Therefore, silver pesos, called dolero in Spain, became the most common coins in trade between the Spanish Empire and Latin America. There were so many silver mines on the southern continent that Spain could mint more coins than any other country in the world. Therefore, the full-weight dolero soon became a means of payment not only in Spanish colonies but in all other colonies on the continent, right up until 1792. By the time the U.S. declared independence from Britain, the silver dolero was used in virtually every state. So the Founding Fathers took the path of least resistance and made the dollar the monetary unit of the new country. Economic boom and the birth of paper money. Thanks to the low base effect, the U.S. economy developed so rapidly that silver and gold coins soon became insufficient to cover goods. So, alongside coins, states began issuing paper dollars. Freedom of credit and entrepreneurship led to every state having its own banks, and every bank started printing its own dollars. In the mid-19th century, banks issued so much paper uncontrollably to cover war expenses that by the end of the Civil War, only a third of dollars were backed by gold and silver. It became clear to the government that a decentralized banking system not only weakened the dollar, but also led to regular stock market crises. Therefore, in 1913, the U.S. created its central bank, the Federal Reserve System. And just in time, because a year later World War I broke out in Europe, and that's when the dollar could really spread its wings. World War I. The dollar's first global moment. With the start of the war, expenses of leading European powers grew rapidly. To cover them, England, France, and Germany actively printed money, and as a result, their quantity no longer matched the gold they held in reserves. The U.S. was in no hurry to enter the war. Moreover, they began actively lending to England and France, thereby reducing their external debt. The Golden Windfall. America after WWI. By the end of World War I, the U.S. had issued loans worth $10 billion, of which $7 billion were spent by Europeans buying American weapons. Plus, many companies and wealthy gentlemen preferred to keep money not in war-torn Europe, but in reliable American banks. As a result, by the early 1920s, the U.S. economy had accumulated half of the world's gold reserves. Such financial stimulus, along with the invention of electricity, automobiles, radio, and cinema, very quickly led to economic overheating. The country was hit by the Great Depression, and who knows how long the U.S. economy would have climbed out of the crisis pit if not for World War II. World War II. Repeat performance, bigger stage. The scenario repeated itself. While all parts of the world were engulfed in war, the U.S. practiced making effective business decisions. Without initially entering combat, the states provided regular assistance to allies through the Lend-Lease program, which was far from free. Great Britain, for example, finally paid off the U.S. for this assistance quite recently, in 2006. But most importantly, as a result of actively lending to Europe and kindly providing the reliable Fort Knox for storing other countries' gold bars, by the end of the war, the U.S. had collected 3/4 of the planet's entire gold reserves. Bretton Woods, the dollar becomes king. Therefore, it's no surprise that in 1944, in the small town of Bretton Woods, the states proposed to the entire world to use the dollar in international settlements. Well, why not? Partners will pay off U.S. debts who knows when. Gold is too bulky and heavy to transport back and forth across the ocean. And here's a reliable and convenient reserve currency. And if they promise free exchange of dollars for gold, then why not? It's really convenient, thought the conference participants, and agreed. Sounds good, but you sense some catch, right? And clearly something happened since then, because today the U.S. government doesn't exchange dollars for metal. The gold rush, literally. After World War II ended, Europe's economy began to recover and gradually grow wealthier. Gold prices on free markets also rose, and exchanging dollars for gold at the U.S. government's fixed rate became increasingly profitable. Charles de Gaulle was the first to break. In 1965, the President of France sent a ship to the States carrying $750 million in cash, followed by a second identical ship. The U.S. reluctantly paid up, and Fort Knox lost 1,650 tons of gold. Wait, we could do that too, thought other countries, and also lined up for the giveaway. The U.S. gold reserve shrank by more than 2.5 times while the market price of gold continued to rise. Nixon's shock, the end of gold. Therefore, in 1971, President Richard Nixon shut down the shop and declared that now the dollar is not tied to gold, and whoever didn't make it is too late. It became clear that all these years, dollars were printed in such volumes that they had long ceased to correspond to U.S. gold reserves. 5 years later in Jamaica, countries agreed that from now on currency rates are set like prices for other goods, on the market as a result of supply and demand. And gold also became a commodity from then on and stopped performing the payment function. The dollar survives its own default. But despite this default, nobody abandoned the dollar. After all, it had already participated in all international settlements for several decades. The dollar penetrated the world economy so deeply that all subsequent crises that started in the States were actively exported to other countries. Having received the green light for unlimited emission, the U.S. revved up the printing press to full speed. If in 2005, $6.5 trillion circulated in the American economy, today it's more than $21 trillion. The money supply grew by 300%. Guess by what percentage the volume of American production increased during this time? 170%. Doesn't anything seem off? At this rate, you might think the dollar is a pyramid scheme that will collapse sooner or later. But that's unlikely, of course. Replacing one reserve currency with another, even over decades, is an impossible task, and a new Bretton Woods obviously won't happen soon, unless it's a black swan event. Why the dollar still rules. Therefore, it's no surprise that for the last 20 years, half of international trade has been conducted in dollars, and no trend change is expected. The dollar's stability relative to other currencies makes U.S. Treasury debt the safest investment in the world. Just think about it. The country's debts have doubled in the last 15 years, but financiers consider buying them a risk-free investment. How is that possible? It's elementary. Who would you rather lend money to, a poor acquaintance or a rich one? The answer is obvious. That's why the whole world invests in the reliable U.S. economy, because there really aren't many alternatives. And even the U.S. trade balance deficit doesn't change anything. The U.S. sells fewer goods and services to the world than it consumes, but what do they pay with? That's right, with the ever-handy dollar. Well, since everyone needs it so much, it would be nice to have it on hand, thinks every country's central bank. Therefore, in international reserves, the dollar accounts for more than half of all other currencies combined. The final twist. Faith is currency. It turns out that the dollar's power rests on public faith in its reliability, which is reinforced by the institutions of American society. And the shaky position of the dollar that I've described to you isn't its weakness. These are difficulties that the whole world will have to solve sooner or later. As U.S. Treasury Secretary John Connally once said, "The dollar is our currency, but your problem."